many people struggle to implement data mesh. I think that's why it's starting to get, if you look at LinkedIn, which may or may not be advisable, but if you look at LinkedIn, people start saying data mesh is dead and things like that. And it's because a lot of organizations are struggling to implement it. They see data mesh, they've read about it, read some great books about it, read some good articles about it, and they're like, okay, I want this, I'm going to implement data mesh. And they start a 2-year transformation project, have 20 million euros budget, and try to implement data mesh to the letter as described in one of the many great books about data mesh. And they struggle. They struggle to deliver value incrementally. They struggle to get to where they want to go, this perfect utopia of a perfect data mesh. Their projects end up running out of steam. They end up losing their budget, and it ends up being a bit of a failure. And that's happening a lot. It's happening too often, I think. I think the problem is, data mesh is great. Loads of great ideas in it. Obviously, I think it's great. I want to be at a data mesh conference. But there's no single path you can take from where you are today to a perfect data mesh where you want to be tomorrow. It's a difficult path to take. And there's not really enough description, enough documentation, enough paths to follow that you can just walk down the same path as someone else. Because your company's going to be different to every other company. Probably got the same sort of problems, but how you change your culture, how you bring in the expertise you need, how you bring in the tooling you need, that's probably very different for your company compared to any other company. So you get this huge gap between where you are today, where you want to go tomorrow, and you don't know the path to take. I think it's a bit like, that meme, some of you might have seen that meme where it's a bit old, where there's like, draw an owl. It's like, draw some circles, step 1. Step 2, draw the rest of the owl. I think it's a little bit like that with data mesh. It's like, draw some circles, and then implement domains, data products, self-serve data platform, federated computational governance, all these quantums, all these other great things. But how do you go from where you are today to this data mesh? Do you even need to go all the way to a data mesh? What problems are you trying to solve with data mesh that you can maybe implement quicker using the ideas from data mesh? And how can you implement those quicker and cheaper using other techniques? And that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about how you can implement some of the techniques of some of the principles of data mesh. Maybe all of them, maybe some of them, depends on the problems you're trying to solve, and how you can do so using data contracts as a foundation. But before I do that, I'm going to start with the problems you're trying to solve, because I think it's always best to keep those problems in mind when you think about what we're trying to achieve. And really, when it comes to the problems that we have in data, they are the same old problems that we've had for a long time. They're not particularly new, not particularly unique to us. We've been struggling for a long time. And in many ways, the problems are not getting better. In fact, they're getting worse, which is why I think we need new approaches like data mesh. So what are these problems? I've got a couple of stats from a couple of surveys to highlight what these problems are. The first one is from DBT. And DBT run this survey every year, and they ask data practitioners, so data engineers, analytics engineers, people like that, what are the obstacles they face when trying to implement or build their data for analytics. And they found that 56% of practitioners highlight data quality as one of their chief obstacles. And that may not be surprising to many of you, data quality being an issue. That sounds quite common. In fact, I would have thought it might be higher, this number. I think what's most interesting about this stat is that 2 years ago it was 41%. So data quality has been an issue for data teams for as long as we've had data, but it's not really getting better. It seems to be getting worse, if anything. Another stat I've got to show you is one from a company called Nash Squared, and they ask business leaders, it's not data leaders, but business leaders, about what they want to achieve with data. And this is what they found in their respondents. They found that 64% of organizations think that data analytics are the way to deliver competitive advantage, yet only 1 in 5 are using it to deliver increased revenue. And I kind of like this stat. I go back to it quite a lot because it just shows this huge gap, really, between the aspirations of company leaders, what they can achieve with data, and what they're actually seeing from their data teams, from their investment in data. And this is also not great, so we need to improve this somehow. And really we talk about data quality as being a problem, but there's a bit more nuance than that. So I want to go through 4 groups of problems that, like I said, we've been having for a long time, and we need to think about how we can solve those and maybe look at different ways of solving them than what we have done before. First problem is around data quality and whether data meets the needs of its users. And often it doesn't. It doesn't meet the needs of its users. So if you're thinking, many of you here might be data engineers, the data you're getting from the source systems, it's not really made for you to consume. You're often extracting it from source systems using change data capture or ELT, or if it's more like a third-party service using 5-channel stitch or something. And you're just dumping that in your data warehouse, your data lake. And then you have to then do a lot of work, spend a lot of money, spend a lot of time transforming that data into something that can actually be used before you can actually use it to deliver some value. Very expensive, very time-consuming, impacting your ability to deliver quality value to your company. And it's a problem. It's been a problem for a long time, and we're going to talk later about potential solutions to that problem. The next problem I want to highlight is about how we as data teams often become a bottleneck. We have so many things we can be doing across the company, and we just can't do them all. So we end up having loads of requests coming in, they go in the backlog. We could do the top X%, 10%, 5%. The rest of them we're not going to get to. We just haven't got time. We never get to them. And that's a shame because that really limits the applicability of our data. We've got all this great data we could use. It could be used for important things, maybe not for critical things that we have to work on, but could be used for important things. But because every data project needs a data person from a central data team to execute it, projects can't get started until we have that resource. And if you're lucky, you can keep hiring. Most of us these days, we can't hire as much as we want to either, so it's a problem that's getting worse again. So we need to move away from becoming the central bottleneck, becoming more of a empowering function for the rest of business, unlocking the rest of the data without all data processing going through our one central team. But even when we are in this situation, people don't just stop using data. They do try and find a way around it. So what you'll see in many organizations is they'll work out how they can use the data, where they can get it from, start building their own little pipelines, doing the best they can to actually use the data because they need that data for something that's important to them locally. Like maybe some results from an A/B test, or maybe some product metrics that they need to understand so they can decide on where to invest. Important things for them, not necessarily more important than revenue numbers or fraud detection or whatever might be more important than that, but important to them. So they start thinking about how they can grab some data, move it around, store it in maybe spreadsheets, maybe in a part of their warehouse they can get access to. But now you've got another problem, because now you've got this data that's being produced that's not being managed at all, not being managed centrally. So how do you ensure the data that they are creating, manipulating, managing is compatible with what you are storing centrally? How do you ensure that it's standardized, you can use it for other purposes? And that's one of the downsides of decentralization usually, is that you feel like you're losing control of that data. You feel like you lose the ability to ensure this compatibility and standardization. So we need a solution for that if we're going to do more decentralization and make it more of a strategy rather than just saying what's happening on the side as people try and get their work done with data. And the final problem is you now have different data owners in the business as you move to a more centralized model. But how can you be sure they're actually following the centrally defined policies? How are they following this governance? And what you could do, and what many people do with data governance, as we heard from some talks earlier, is you start making them follow processes. Complete checklist every quarter saying, I am looking after data correctly. But even then, that's not what people want to be doing. They're not really going to invest their best effort into following that checklist. It's just a checkbox exercise, exactly that. So although they're saying they are doing this, are you certain they are following these policies? I think it's important that we are certain, particularly if you're working in a more regulated industry like I do. I work in finance. Or if you're just handling personal data. We know data regulation is becoming more and more widespread. It's becoming more and more strict. A lot of privacy rules, AI regulation. We need to ensure that the governance is being handled correctly. We need to be able to prove that it's being implemented correctly. So we've got this kind of set of problems, not just data quality, but more beyond that we need to solve. And I think to solve it, we need a different approach. The approaches we've been taking so far, they haven't really been improving things enough. So we need a more decentralized approach, but we need to do so with more collaboration, with more autonomy, while still maintaining the appropriate governance. And we need to do this now in particular because our data is being used for more and more important processes. For example, product features, AI, things like that. We want to be better than that 1 in 5 that's using it to drive revenue. We want to be one of those that can do this. And data mesh has answers for many of these problems. And I imagine most of you know this already, so I'm not going to go into too much detail about data mesh, but you know it's got its 4 principles where it aims to solve some of these problems. It tries to ensure that data does meet the needs of its consumers. It tries to explicitly decentralize the management and production of data and move the ownership away from central data teams into the domains, into the subject matter experts who actually own this data. It tries to encourage more responsiveness in terms of how data can be used through autonomy. So you don't have to have all data projects go through the central data team just to get anything done. And it still tries to maintain this governance in this decentralized model. And it does this through these 4 principles. We've heard about data products quite a lot today, so I'm not going to talk more about that in too much detail. But you have data as a product, you have the ownership of domains, taking ownership for our own data because they're best placed to. You have a self-serve data platform that is empowering all of this and promoting all of this. And you have federated computational governance, which is a bit of a mouthful, but basically we talk about automating governance, and we heard that earlier as well. But I think when it comes to these principles, like I was saying at the start, you could try and implement them all as one big transformation project. But if you've worked in IT for any length of time, you know these big 2-year transformation projects, they have quite a low success rate, and they tend not to deliver the value they promise on time and on budget. They tend to struggle to do that. So when I'm thinking about implementing data mesh, I'm not necessarily thinking about selling data mesh to the organization as one big project. I'm thinking about what are the problems I've got now, and how can I use these principles of data mesh to help me solve these problems as a guide. I mean, how can I implement those principles? I tend to use data contracts to implement those principles quickly and easily to solve those individual problems that I have today. And that's what I'm going to talk about in the last part of this session, exactly how you might go and do that. Again, I'm not going to say you have to implement all of these overnight. It's how you can use these ideas, these patterns, to implement some of these principles to solve the problems that you have right now. So going back to the problems that I mentioned earlier, and the data mesh principle that tries to solve them. So one of the problems I mentioned earlier is the data is not of right quality, doesn't meet the needs of its consumers. And the idea is we have this data as a product mindset, this principle, that can help us produce data that does meet the needs of its consumers. And when I think of data as a product, we had a good talk earlier this morning about exactly what a data product is and the components of that. But for me, it's more of a mindset. It's applying this product mindset to the data. So if there's data being created, so why is it being created? Who does it serve? What's its job to be done? Why does it exist? Is it well documented? Can someone actually use it? Is it usable? Is it owned? Data should be owned. If it's not important enough to own, then it's probably not important enough to generate and maintain. So it needs to have ownership. And what's the life cycle of this data? How can I be confident in using this data by knowing how data can be deleted, how it's created, the whole life cycle around it? I need to know that to be able to use the data. And this product mindset is not new to data. It's been applied to many internal applications for a while now. So if you think about, my background is more in software engineering and platform engineering. So as in platform engineering, we create platforms for developers, software developers, and we're constantly thinking about the developer experience. How can I use these platforms? And we are applying that product mindset to those platforms to make sure it solves a problem for them, allows them to get their job done more easily and more quickly. It's the same for data, same for any product. You're thinking about how you can solve those problems for those users and do so they can use it quickly and cheaply to deliver the value they need to deliver. Also with products, you're not doing this in isolation. If you're building this product for someone, you need to work with them to understand what they need. Same for any product you're creating. Right? You can't just put a product on the marketplace and just expect people to use it. You need to understand why you're building this, who's going to use it, why do they need it, what do they need, what are their requirements. It needs to be a lot more collaborative than just chucking the data in a data warehouse, putting a table there and just saying, there you go, that's your payments data. So we need to foster this collaboration. And that's a two-way street, right? It's not just on the data owners start coming to you and saying, tell me your requirements. We as data people, we need to get much better at fostering this collaboration, driving this collaboration, providing our requirements, articulating the value that we are going to create from this data, really selling to the company why we need this data, why we need it of right quality, why we need it at this, why it needs to meet the requirements, what we're going to do with it. What we're doing there is bringing the incentives. Again, this was mentioned earlier about the incentives. Because if we can bring those incentives, and we can do that well, there's no reason why the data owners can't start to take more responsibility for the quality, for making sure changes are managed effectively, so you're not just breaking every day, for providing data through standardized interfaces, and for providing data that meets expectations and will do over the long term. For example, setting SLOs and making sure they are met over the long term. Because if I can do that, then I can start building on that with confidence, knowing that it's not going to change. It's not going to just break one day and all my stuff's going to break. I need that confidence, so I'm going to build something of value downstream. So you might start capturing this in document. You might start having things in there like some documentation, describing exactly what this means. You might have things like a schema, maybe some data quality checks in there. You can start capturing this in document. And you could just capture that in a web page, a conference page, a wiki page, whatever you've got. Or you can capture it in something a bit more structured like this. I'm using YAML, it doesn't have to be YAML. And the reason I'm showing it in YAML is because it's kind of human and machine readable. And we'll see why that's important later, and why that allows this documentation to go beyond just documentation and be something a lot more useful than that. So it's going to be kept up to date over the long term, even as data evolves. The second problem I mentioned earlier was around bottlenecks and centralization. And as I'm sure you know, the way data mesh aims to solve this is through moving ownership kind of left into the domains, to people who actually own this data. So let's have a look how we can do that. The reason why I want to do that is to really, we can't just shift ownership without, like, just say you own this and just kind of run away. You have to really empower domains to own their own data. And we have to understand exactly what it means to be owners of data. So what does it actually mean? What are the accountabilities, what are the responsibilities of being a data owner? What does it mean to be a data owner? And then we need to move to a model where we're starting to have these data owners publish data and share their data to the rest of the organisation, not just have data as a byproduct where it's being extracted from databases, but being actively produced and published to the rest of the organisation. I think one of the mistakes we've made as an industry recently, over the last 10 or 20 years or so, is we have assumed that data can only be pulled from systems, and we have things like change data capture, and we have things like ELT and things like that. We just chuck it into our data warehouse or data lakes, and we assume that's all we can get, and we have to then build on it, do all the transformation work ourselves. But why is that the case? It could be the case because we are not producing anything of value from that data. That's not worth the effort upstream. But we hopefully are. We want to produce things of value from data. And if we're doing that, why are we just accepting poor quality inputs and being expected to provide good quality outputs? It's very difficult to do that, as we found over the last 10, 20 years. I think what we want to move to is more a publication of data. Data that's being generated for its consumers that meets its needs. Again, it's product mindset data, not data that's just being chucked around without any thought. Problem is, as data moves around the company in a more decentralized model, is it passes from different groups, different domains, different divisions, wherever you want to use in your company. And it's these ownership boundaries where you often have problems. Because people then need to understand the data before they can use it. And they're not experts in your data. They don't know your data. So they need to have some description, some documentation about what this data is before they can build on it with confidence. They also don't know how you're creating this data. I'm not sure they really care. But if I'm building on data, I need to know how reliable it's going to be before I can put it into production in my system and provide it to my customers. So it's really at these boundaries of ownership where it's most important to have these expectations set. Because what happens in the absence of expectations, people assume the best based on what they've seen. So let's say I had this kind of recently. I was looking at a data set, and the last 5 days, it seems to be updated hourly. Let's say I assume that to be true, because it was true when I observed it, and I build my system on that assumption. I say, okay, this data is coming to me hourly, it's always in the structure, and I then use that and tell my consumers it'll be ready every hour, because that's what I'm getting. But this owning team, they haven't promised every hourly data. It just happens to be that way this week. But then they've got no monitoring, they've got no observability. Next week it's kind of 2 hours, week after it's 4 hours. No one even notices until your consumers over here say, hey, this hourly data hasn't been updated for like 6 hours, what's going on? And you're like, well, my one's working. My one's, let's check the upstream. You're like, well, no, we didn't promise this. It's just, we're not really investing much in this data set actually anyway. So why did you assume it's hourly? You're like, well, that's what I observed. The problem there is there's no expectations being set between these boundaries. So people just assume the best in the absence of expectations. So it's really important to have those expectations set and you can capture those in a data contract. And it's really important if you move into a centralized model with domain ownership to have those boundaries well defined. So we start capturing that again in a document, say a data contract. We might capture the ownership, might capture the expectations, the SLOs in this case. So now it's here, written down, that this data will be hourly. So I know that, they know that, my consumers know that, everyone knows that. It's written down in black and white and orange. When it comes to defining these things, though, it's really important to understand who owns the expectations that are being set, who owns this data contract. And I strongly believe that it has to be owned by the people producing the data. because only they have the ability to meet those expectations. It's all very good me saying, I want my data hourly, but they might have the process producing that data might not be capable of making it hourly. It might be too expensive to make it hourly, the architecture might not be correct, it might take months of effort to do so. They might be able to do 2 hourly, and maybe that would work for me, but they can't do hourly. So me saying your data has to be hourly might not be possible. It's not really conducive to a great collaboration, to a great relationship. I can make my requirements, make them clear, explain why hourly is important, explain the value I'm going to create, but I can't force them to make it hourly. They need to be empowered to own their own expectations with the limitations they have, with the context they have, with the understandings they have of their systems and data, and therefore they must own this contract, these expectations, and be committed, be happy and confident they can meet those. So therefore I have to own the data contract. I think that's very important. The next problem is around compatibility and standardization. So we're going to this decentralized model, it's great. We've got people owning their own data, it's great. Providing it to the rest of the business through nice interfaces. But how are we going to support them to do that? How are we going to make it easy for them to do that and ensure that this data is being shared in a consistent and standardized way? And the way we do that is by providing this self-serve data platform, again, from Data Mesh. And this is where I spend most of my time working on data platform. And when I'm building data platforms, I'm really thinking a lot about how we can empower people to own their own data, manage their own data, and do so as easily as possible. And I do that by promoting their own autonomy. Autonomy is one of my favorite words. I use it a lot because when you promote autonomy, allow people to own their own data, be in control of their own data, have that kind of authority over their own data, it really breeds a great sense of ownership of that data. Like, yeah, this is my data, I'm providing it to my customers. It's up to me to decide how I structure that based on more context I've got from my domain and my systems. It's up to me to decide on the expectations and be comfortable meeting those. It's my data. I shouldn't have to, if I want to make changes to the data to meet the needs of my customers, I shouldn't need a central review from a data architect or a data engineer or someone else, someone centrally. Because again, you're interested in bottleneck there. We're trying to move away from bottlenecks. They should have the ability to evolve their own data as they see fit to meet their own needs and the needs of their customers. But how do we do that while still ensuring things are consistent and standardized? We do that by implementing guardrails in the platform itself. So, for example, with change management, we might say that if you're making a non-breaking change, that's really easy to do. You can put a new column on your database, your table, merge that, that's fine. We might say, however, if you're making a breaking change to a table, maybe you're changing the structure completely, maybe change data types, doesn't really matter. But it's a breaking change to go and break things downstream. We might put guardrails in platform to prevent those from being deployed to production until a change management process has been followed. So they can still make the changes or they still own their data, but they're operating within these guardrails, preventing the behaviors we don't want to see through the use of tooling and from the platform. And really, it turns out we can build this whole platform around the data contract. And this is where we're starting to see how the data contract moves beyond documentation, which could just easily be in a Google Doc or whatever, to something that's a lot more powerful than that. And that's why we're making it human and machine readable. And the key here is to make the data contract useful beyond just documentation. Because as you know, as anyone will know, documentation, if you've written any documentation, it's all great when you write it, perfectly in sync with the data. But as data evolves, that documentation tends to not evolve at the same speed, tends to lose its value very quickly. And in some ways, in many ways, incomplete or out-of-date documentation is worse than no documentation at all. What we want to do here is make the container of documentation, this data contract, much more useful than just documentation, so that it has to be kept up to date as the data evolves. And that is why I've been showing YAML, and that is why it needs to be machine readable, because we're going to use it to drive a whole data platform. Another thing I want to mention quickly here as well is these data contracts don't exist in isolation. I spoke about this a bit before, about how if I'm working in this middle area as a data engineer, I could put a data contract on my data and say, hey, data scientist, building AI, doing cool stuff, this is what I promise you. But if I haven't got any promises upstream, any expectations set upstream, how can I promise it downstream? I'm just lying to them, basically. I'm making it up. I'm saying this data is going to be every hour, or I'm saying this data, I keep using time because it's quite easy, but I could use any other quality metric. I'm saying this data is going to be of that particular quality, but if my inputs are not of the same quality or better, how can I promise something better downstream? If the data I'm getting here is not timely, how can I make it timely? If there's data of here has no change management and can break at any time, how can I promise this won't break? You need to have expectations set throughout this kind of supply chain, from the start, through the phases in data engineering, or whoever's doing this work, until the end result in the applications of data. And like I said, this is where data contracts moving just beyond documentation. It's being part of the platform that everyone's using to create these data products and share them around the company and provide the tooling. This becomes even more pronounced, I think, when we look at governance, which is the next part. But even before that, like things like data quality checks, you can implement through this way as well. So here, I'm a data product owner. I'm putting some checks around the data. This could just be documentation. I could just say to my consumers, I am going to do these checks. I'm writing them in code. And they could just trust that I do this. And we capture it in documentation, and it will be true at that time of writing. And I promise I'll put it in code later. Promise. But what would be better is why don't we just have a checks in a data contract as documentation, but also have a platform execute this? It's great for the consumer. They know it's being ran because the platform's running this. It's great for the producer of data, the owner of data, because they're not having to write all these code now to run these checks. They're not having to set up Airflow to run these checks every hour. They're not having to set up alerting to their Slack channel. They don't have to do all of that. All they're saying is, I expect these checks to run. And the platform just goes ahead and runs them completely autonomously, completely automated. So it's documentation, but it's also useful in the platform itself. Another example might be populating data catalog. So again, we're moving to a more decentralized model. We don't want data to be siloed everywhere. We have enough information in the data contract to populate a data catalog that has documentation, has SLOs, has the owner, has whatever else you want to put in the data contract, the checks, anything else. We can bring this all together much easier, more easily from the data contracts, because it's got all that extra context, rather than having a data catalog populated by sort of searching your data warehouse and trying to infer what's going on. It's all here, well-defined in a good structure. We can just ingest that and populate a much more useful and up-to-date data catalog than what we had before. And then finally moving on to governance. And how could we be sure people are following these central policies? And data mesh calls this federated computational governance. I find that a bit of a mouthful, so I won't say it too many more times. But I think there's two kind of key words in that. We know what governance means, I hope. Most of us know what governance means. The other two words I think are more important and demonstrate how data mesh is trying to change how we do governance. First one is federated. And this is more about using data, having the data locally defined, have people, again, autonomy, my favorite word again, have people have their own autonomy to manage their own data, but being confident that the centrally defined policies are being followed. So local autonomy, but centrally defined policies being followed. But how do you do that? I already said earlier about how people don't like following manual processes. They're boring, they're hard to follow, they're checklist exercises. Why are we having people manually follow processes when we can automate it through the data platform, through tooling, reducing the reliance on people to follow processes, reducing the risk associated with managing data, making it much easier for people to own and manage their own data without having to become experts in GDPR, because nobody wants to do that. And we could do that again through the data contract. And this is what we do in production. I have been doing in production for 5 or 6 years now. I'm still at a company where we do this, so I can promise you it's been working for a long time now. But what we do is we, in the data contract, again, making it more useful for documentation, we add a few more things in here. We start categorizing our data. Is it personal data or not? If it is personal data, how will we normalize it? What's the strategy there? And that's all we need in the contract. And the tooling, the platform, can then take that definition and apply it to the data using the centrally defined policies and co-define those policies in the tooling itself. So, for example, this is what we do, and we hook up our platform to how GDPR request comes in, deletion request comes in. So a deletion request comes in, our tooling, which is deployed against every data contract, will pick up this request and apply the GDPR deletion request to that data. No matter where it sits in the organization, no matter who owns it, no matter if the data is really wide, 150 columns, if it's really deep, it's really nested, our tooling doesn't care, because the data contract has given us enough context to, quite easy really, build tooling that can apply our policies to the data while still maintaining and retaining that autonomy of data owners to structure data how they like. They do what they like, they just give us just about enough context to apply potentially defined policies to their data by categorizing their data. And this is also good because they are the ones who know the data most. They know if the data is personal data or not. I don't know their data. Why should I be deciding if it's personal data or not? They know it best. Have them do the definitions. Other examples, and again, these are things we all do in production. We already do in production. Automate access management. Again, why are you having everyone decide how to provide access to their database tables, to their data products? We can automate a lot of that way through classifications and role-based access. And often your chief data officer will have to populate a catalog and processing, data and processing catalog around how data is being used and where it's being used. Again, why are they having to go to the business and ask for every quarter, every year to sign off on compliance? Let's just automate all that away. And what we've done here is we've started to build what we call a contract-based data platform. And really, again, these are all things we're doing. Every capability we've wanted to add to the data platform over the last 6 years or so, we've added via data contracts. We just extended the definition a little bit if we need to. Often we don't. For backups, we didn't need to. We just did backups. It was free. We gave it to everyone. Extend the definition and build the tooling. And the tooling is not that hard to build either when you've got the right context from the data contract. And this is great for, it's a win-win for everyone. It's great for the chief data officer. They are certain that we are compliant because it's all done by a platform. It's great for the data owner. They are not having to build all this tooling around data to be data owners. It's all done for them. They don't have to know how backups are done. It's just done for them. They know it's backed up. They know for certain that's done. They don't need to think about how we're going to back up their own data. They don't need to think about how we're going to update the data catalog. They don't need to think about access management, data retention. They don't need to think about all of that. They can focus on providing good quality data products to the business so that the people building on data can deliver value. And it's good for the data platform team because every capability we add is automatically deployed to I think we have around 350 data contracts in production. Every capability we add or improve, deploy to everyone straight away. So it's a really great way of building data platforms that are much more powerful and flexible than we had before. Problem is we do tend to have to write a lot of this glue tooling to convert our data contract, which I showed in YAML, but in our case it's actually something different. Always converting these contracts to a different format so we can make use of other tooling, whether that's populating the processing catalog, whether that's anonymization and retention tooling. We're always converting our contract from, say, YAML to JSON schema to protobuf to whatever. It would be quite cool if there was a way to just convert it to one standard format and just have all tooling work with that. And that is what, as a few of us here today, are working towards with this open standard called Bittle, which you can go to bittle.io to have a look at. And obviously it's still early days, but we're hoping for a really reduce the cost of integration, really easing interoperability between different data tooling, and potentially even sharing data across organizations in a more standard way could be a future goal for this, by having data described in a standardized way using data contracts. So I covered quite a lot of ground there. Initially started talking about data mesh and problems we want to solve, before talking about how trying to do a whole data mesh overnight is difficult. So how can we start applying some of the principles and implementing those principles through smaller tooling, in my case through data contracts. I just want to leave you 3 key takeaways. I do strongly feel that if we're going to solve the problems that we've had for a long time, particularly around data quality and data ownership, we need to think of a different way to approach that. Because what we're doing before, have been doing for 20 years, isn't working so well. I think data mesh is a great solution for many of these problems. The principles are great, it's a really great idea, but it's a really big idea as a whole, and it's very hard to go from wherever you are today to a data mesh. So the way I tend to approach it is, let's not do a big transformation project for data mesh. Let's use principles to guide us, solve our particular problems today using tooling, in my case, data contracts through the data platform. And do this iteratively, solving problem after problem, investing in the tooling, and over time moving us gradually towards a data mesh organization. Thanks very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far and the rest of it as well today. If you want to find out more about data contracts, I have this ebook you can download for free, which also gets you on my newsletter, but you don't have to stay there if you don't like it. And if you like my book, I have a few copies to give away, but only 5, unfortunately. My publisher's not very generous. So we have to rush if you want it, because there's more than 5 of you here. But if you don't get that, there's this discount code you could potentially use if you're interested in buying it. And in that, I talk a lot more about this platform I'm building through data contracts. But that's enough selling. Thank you very much for your time. Hope you enjoy the talk. And hopefully you've got some time for questions. So thank you.
Thank you.